Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest in the SPE Live series. Today we're going to be talking about building the hydrogen economy. So my apologies for the slight delay in our session today. Unfortunately, we had some technical issues right at the beginning, but I can tell you right now I'm live from COP26, so it's quite a busy environment in here. So that's my slightly more less salubrious environment for the talk. Now, today's discussion is going to be fantastic. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Today on the discussion, we've got Molly Iffy, who's commercial manager on the Dolphin Project with ERM. Also, we've got Matthew, who's a head of market development at Siemens Energy. So these are two excellent candidates we have. And really what this is a taster session for the upcoming Hydrogen Workshop that will be taking place on the 16th and 17th of November. So it's an excellent opportunity to basically find out a little bit about what we're going to be discussing at hydrogen's role in fueling the energy transition. So this two-day virtual event will feature both Matthew and Molly and a number of other guests in the discussions looking at hydrogen, how it's going to build out and what that can mean for SPE and the wider aspects. So without further ado, I'm going to go to introduce our guests, and I'm really kind of going to the first question. So up on screen, what we'll see now, we'll have Molly and Matthew joining. So it's great to have both of you here, and thanks very much for taking the time to come along and participate in the SPE Live with everybody else. Now, to set the scene for you for the discussion, for yourself, Matthew, I kind of want to come to you first. And really, from your perspective, I guess, the UK government has ambitious plans. And it's been, so really, from your perspective, what do you think that involves?
Well, very simply put, the UK can't deliver its net zero plan without hydrogen. So the government's hydrogen strategy that was published last month is to build an industry that by 2050 will be delivering several hundred terawatt hours of low carbon hydrogen every year. And to put that into perspective, that's something of equivalent scale to the whole of the UK's electricity industry today, built from nothing in less than 30 years. We're going to use that hydrogen to decarbonise many different parts of the economy, everything from transport through industry and potentially a lot of uses in heat. To make that hydrogen, the government's going to follow a twin track approach, both carbon capture and storage enabled and electrolytic production. And those are often called blue hydrogen and green hydrogen for short. Now, low carbon hydrogen, it's the same end product, but the two industries to make it are really very different. And when the government talks about twin track, we don't think of two parallel train tracks running off into the distance. Really, it's like two completely different journeys. It's like going from London to COP26 in Glasgow via the East Coast Main Line or the West Coast Main Line, if you're familiar with the UK rail network. So same end product, different industries and different needs. So blue hydrogen is made in large quantities by big, effectively chemical plants, large investment decisions, and it's going to happen in the industrial clusters around the edges of the country. Whereas green hydrogen can start much smaller, less than a megawatt today, and then scale up. And we'll do more projects in more places and larger projects. But both of them, if they're successful, will get to gigawatt scale by the end of this decade. And the government has a target of 5 gigawatts of production capacity by 2030. And the Scottish government has another 5 gigawatts. And it's never quite clear how those two sit with each other. But I think the main thing is let's get the first gigawatt built by the middle of the decade, and then we can ramp on up from there. Today's low carbon hydrogen is really very small. There are only 8 refueling stations in the country. There are a handful of assets on Orkney, and there's a small company called Geopura who do off-grid power supplies using hydrogen. And you might have seen recently that the Netflix television series Bridgerton used hydrogen instead of diesel to power some of its location shoots. But if you put all of that together, it's today less than 10 megawatts of production capacity. So this is an industry that needs to grow by 3 orders of magnitude during this decade. And that's the sort of growth rate that even a .com would be proud of. So government is working in collaboration with the industry to support that growth in several areas. They need to work on standards and regulation. If we're going to put if we're going to put hydrogen into the existing gas network, we need to change the rules about what that network is allowed to carry. There are a number of trials and demonstrations. You might have heard of things like High Deploy. There's a small village in northeast England called Winlayton, where they now have 100% hydrogen supply. So people will have cooked their breakfasts this morning on hydrogen gas. There are also much bigger plans. So the FEED studies are underway for large carbon capture clusters, large carbon capture projects in the industrial clusters around the edges of the country. And the government's already put £175 million in of match funding to support those studies. And just a couple of weeks ago, awarded the first two projects or agreed to sequencing for the first two projects. One for HyNet in the northwest of England, and the other one for the East Coast cluster, which runs from Teesside down to the River Humber. Excuse me. The government has also introduced or is introducing a financial support model, and that's designed to bring in private sector investment so that it can leverage government fund to deliver larger scale hydrogen production. And consultations on that business model and something called the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, which can offer capital grants, closed last week. And in the budget that was also last week, the Chancellor announced a further £100 million for the first 250 megawatts of green hydrogen projects by 2023. And the industry is responding to that strategy by developing projects and starting to build the supply chain. And we'll hear a bit more about some of those projects in a minute.
Excellent. No, and that's really good. And what's fascinating here is about the number of projects that are actually taking place right now. And I guess it's great to see that there's so much, more activity in these areas, and that's an important aspect, particularly for building out the hydrogen economy. So, Molly, if I turn to you for a second, I guess you're the commercial manager with Dolphin Project. So, can you tell us a little bit about Dolphin and the works that you're doing with ERM?
Yep, certainly, John. Can you hear me okay? Yep, brilliant. Okay, so the ERM Dolphin Project is a fantastic example of a homegrown green hydrogen production project that has the potential to deliver hydrogen at scale in the UK and also worldwide. It's been developed by ERM, which is headquartered in the UK, but also in partnership with other organisations which are really at the top of their game, like Principal Power, who are working on the substructure, and Tractable Energy, and the also offshore design engineering, and NEL, who's working on the electrolyzer, and Doosan, that's working on the electrical side of things. So a really fantastic team is working to build this project. What is the ERM Dolphin Project? So it comprises a semi-submersible floating platform on which you have a wind turbine, so a minimum of 10 megawatts capacity, but likely to quickly scale to a much larger wind turbine size. Also on the floating platform, you have desalination equipment to desalinate seawater, so there's no need for fresh water for the solution, and electrolyzers. So the hydrogen is produced offshore at the location where the renewable energy is generated. The hydrogen is then exported through a flexible riser to a trunk pipeline on the seabed, and brought back to shore. So from that, you can immediately see that there's massive opportunities to deploy a concept like this in some of the offshore wind locations which we have around the UK, which might be further from shore. There's excellent wind resource, but if you were to build electricity transmission back to shore, it would be extremely expensive, or you might have a lot of losses. You might have issues with grid connection to the grid, or punitive grid charges for some areas of Scotland. So there's enormous potential for this type of concept. And we're looking to deploy a 10 megawatt commercial demonstrator project off the coast of Aberdeen in 2024, and which would feed into the nascent hydrogen economy that's been developing in that region. but then quickly look to move to much larger scale commercial projects. So by the end of this decade, we would have 2 or 3 projects in the hundreds of megawatts scale, and we're in advanced discussions with partners developing sites for those. And then in the 2030s, we would then look to move to gigawatt scale, and that's really where you see key advantages emerging in terms of economies of scale for the key equipment items and also for the O&M associated with the projects, which really helps to bring down the cost of green hydrogen to cost parity with other options. So really a really exciting project, homegrown, as I say, and supported by the UK government. And we're looking to actively engage with the supply chain, including companies in the oil and gas sector that are looking to pivot into hydrogen. So if this is of interest to anyone listening on this webinar and they're keen to get involved, we're really interested in speaking to partners who are looking to, who see the opportunity for hydrogen and can help us to deploy at scale quickly moving forward. Thanks, John. Back to you.
That's excellent. Thanks, Molly, for that. Like, it's so important that that we have a sort of the opportunity for a decentralized hydrogen system, and I guess that's what Dolphin are really bringing to the picture here. And also, like, it's often said that it's far more cost efficient to transport molecules as opposed to electrons. So the whole ability of removing sort of large scale cabling from the system as well is something that obviously creates those efficiencies. So again, it's exciting to see a project, even if it's at this demonstrator scale at this stage, but the opportunity to be able to build out and those developments as well. So thanks for the input there, and it's really great to find out more about Dolphin. So if I go back to yourself, Matthew, I guess Dolphin's one example of a project, but what other projects do you see, and what other developments do you see happening regionally and internationally?
Well, my personal focus is the UK, and just in the UK, we're already seeing projects of a wide range of different scales and for a wide range of use cases, and they're all being worked on in parallel. As Molly said, if you're going to one day build a gigawatt scale project, you sort of need to have done 100 megawatts first, and to do 100 megawatts, you need to have done 10 megawatts before that. And the supply chain to deliver that is going to need to ramp up too, and there's no shortcuts. We need to learn on the smaller projects and de-risk the larger projects and help bring the cost down. So across the different sectors, we've seen that there are certain types of use case that naturally come first. So in transport, we've seen, for example, hydrogen buses, because they're under the control of local authorities. They set out from the same point every morning, and they're fairly predictable in the journey. So they're quite an appropriate early use case for hydrogen. But over the next few years, we'll start to see construction machinery and trucks. And by mid-decade, we're already working on projects for trains and shipping. And hopefully by the end of the decade, we'll be into hydrogen for aviation, whether that's as hydrogen itself or as synthetic aviation fuels or other hydrogen derivatives. And we'll see other patterns in the other industrial sectors. So one of the early industries that's looking promising for using hydrogen in the UK is, for example, the Scotch whisky industry, because that's a premium product. You make it now and you sell it in 10 years' time. And in 10 years' time, an environmentally friendly product is going to be even more valuable than it is today. But we're seeing other early use cases, things like film and television production, green tourism, and data centers are starting to consider hydrogen. And as the cost comes down and as it becomes a more widespread commodity, other use cases start to open up, and eventually we can see even some of the hardest to decarbonize parts of the economy can switch over towards hydrogen. So for us as an electrolyzer manufacturer, we are bidding 10 megawatt scale projects at the moment, but we are also talking to people about 500 megawatt or even gigawatt scale offshore wind to hydrogen projects all at the same time.
No, that's excellent. And it's so interesting as well when you look at the hydrogen economy itself, because like a lot of times I think that we're building out this scale in order to tackle problems that we know we have in areas of decarbonisation. But as that scale builds out and as those costs go down for hydrogen, what's most likely to happen is that unknown use cases that we haven't thought of yet will start to build out of in the economy. And I think for me that's a really exciting aspect, because the things we have right now that we know we can affect through deployment of hydrogen, but there's also things that we don't know about yet, which will come to the fore when the opportunity presents itself. So I think that creates an exciting opportunity, not only for the development of hydrogen economy, but also for the build out of hydrogen production itself. But so I guess in a lot of respects as well, if we bring it back to sort of an oil and gas, similar to oil and gas, we've got an upstream, we've got a downstream, we've got a midstream component. So we've discussed production and end use. But I guess, Molly, there's a lot of discussion with hydrogen as a carrier, and and how we might make it optimal. Do you have a view on this from your perspective?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, John, because there isn't a clear front runner at the moment in terms of hydrogen carrier that is clearly commercially, from a purely commercial perspective, advantageous in all situations. There isn't a clear front runner. But it's certainly the case that regions of strong bulk hydrogen production potential that we expect to emerge in the future, either green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, or other colours of hydrogen, those areas of strong hydrogen potential are not necessarily aligned with the areas where we expect strong hydrogen demand to develop. So, for example, big European industrial clusters. So we need a way of transporting hydrogen effectively between those areas. And at the moment, more than 30% of global primary energy demand is already traded, but we're going to see those trading patterns shift in future from fossil fuel producing nations to bulk hydrogen producing nations and renewables producing nations. So it'll be really interesting to see how those patterns change. And in terms of the options for how we can transport hydrogen by ship or by road, the kind of front runners are ammonia, methanol, or liquid organic hydrogen carriers, and they all have pros and cons. And there are some the particular use cases or situations in which one carrier would work more effectively than another. So, for example, ammonia and methanol can both be used as a carrier, but they can also be used directly as a fuel for some applications or directly as a feedstock. So, depending on the use that the hydrogen that the carrier is being used for, it might be that you don't need to crack it back to hydrogen, which would be a significant cost saving if that carrier was used compared to liquid organic hydrogen carriers. But there are disadvantages of both ammonia and methanol. So ammonia is highly toxic, particularly in a marine environment, and that may prove to be an impediment to its rollout. So, for example, in inland European waterways, its use could be, and transportation could be heavily regulated. And similarly, methanol is hazardous, and it also requires a sustainable source of carbon at the point of methanol production. So both of them have drawbacks, and when you compare them to liquid organic hydrogen carriers, which can be transported at ambient pressure and temperature and stored in repurposed oil infrastructure, there might be significant advantages from an environmental and health and safety perspective associated with liquid organic hydrogen carriers. And this could represent a really interesting opportunity for the oil and gas sector. There's a lot of infrastructure that could be repurposed for the storage of LOHC and the transportation of LOHC. So there's an opportunity to pivot business models and to use infrastructure that might otherwise become obsolete to move into this new area. So that's certainly something that's worth considering for businesses with those types of assets. But just to kind of sum up, when you compare, I mean, ERM's done quite a bit of work on this for the Net Zero Technology Centre and the Scottish Government and several ports as well, looking at the advantages and disadvantages of these types of carriers and which one might be optimal for Scotland as it looks to build a large offshore wind green hydrogen production capability and then export that potentially to use centres in Europe. And it's not clear that ammonia is the front runner from a purely commercial perspective, or LOHC is the front runner. It's likely that instead those EHS considerations or the potential to repurpose existing infrastructure or other elements like repurposing industrial heating for the dehydrogenation of LOHC, for example, those ways of optimizing the business model could prove to be the differentiating factors. But having said that, LOHC is coming from such a low base compared to methanol and ammonia that both have really strong, established global supply chains and production capability that it's difficult to see how LOHC can scale up very, very quickly in the way that will be needed. So it'll be really interesting to see how things develop in the future. Back to you, John. I hope that makes sense.
No, absolutely, Molly. And it's interesting because, like I mentioned, at the moment, I'm actually down at a hydrogen event, and what we're looking at is ship zero and zero shipping for emissions and propulsion purposes. So obviously, the ammonia discussion really comes into that, either for transportation or for end use. And it's interesting to see, from a maritime shipping perspective. The jury's still out. We're still trying to understand whether you got hydrogen carriers or whether you've got ammonia that will be the leader in that. But what's very fascinating for me about hydrogen is the fact that hydrogen is the base, as a derivative. So everything that derives from whether it be methanol or ammonia comes from hydrogen in the first place anyway. So it's such a versatile energy vector, it allows it to be so easily transported. But now I see we've got questions that are piling up. But one last question I have for yourself, Matthew, before we go to the actual Q&A, is just basically, we've talked about projects, we talked about the size, we talked about the opportunities. So when we look at sort of the supply chain, how will the supply chain cope with such rapid growth?
Well, thanks, John. Well, again, blue and green hydrogen are effectively different industries. So blue hydrogen is it's another chemical plant, and there's quite an established supply chain for that. So we're looking at retrofitting carbon capture to existing steam methane reformers that already make hydrogen, or more likely building new and probably slightly differently designed autothermal reformers, the sort of thing that is proposed for the HyNet project, where the chemical process is designed in the first place to capture more of the carbon as part of the process. And then once you've captured that carbon, you need a store somewhere offshore. And certainly in the UK, we're looking at repurposing old gas fields, mostly under the North and the Irish Sea. The green hydrogen industry is much more of a sort of hybrid. So electrolyzers, which are the core component, are a relatively new technology, or certainly the proton exchange membrane design electrolyzers, which have come to the fore more recently. And electrolyzers, for an analogy, they're just about getting to the Model T Ford stage. So we're just starting to see the first serial production, moving on from them being completely hand-built. But there are plans by a number of companies, including Siemens Energy, to open gigafactories in the next few years to make the stacks, which are the core components of these things, in highly automated, large-scale, low-cost factories, and then integrate those into systems much closer to the markets where they're needed. There are a number of key resources that we need for electrolyzers, particularly platinum group metals, and especially things like iridium. And if you're looking at the metal prices, we've seen the price of iridium and the other platinum group metals rise quite steeply at the start of this year. And that's partly based on the expectation of both electrolyzers and fuel cells requiring many more tons of this stuff. The price has settled down a bit recently, and I think it's partly because a lot of these things are also contracyclic. So some of the same raw materials are used in things like catalytic converters for fossil fueled automobiles. So as the one declines, the other will start to rise. But manufacturers have already started securing long-term contracts for supply of the key components, and indeed designing equipment that uses less of them. And in future, there are things at lab scale at the moment that can avoid using them altogether. And all of these, because they are quite valuable components, there's a big focus on recycling as part of the design. When you look at the rest of the balance of plant that goes around the electrolyzer, we're talking water purification, compression, storage. That's a bit of a hybrid of the process industry and the electricity industry. So it's skills and people that we already have, but diverted to a new purpose in the hydrogen industry. And as always, the industry takes time to ramp up. And the thing that will stimulate investment in the supply chain is the visibility of a pipeline of upcoming projects. And we saw in the early days of offshore wind that the countries that got most of the jobs were the countries that started to build a pipeline of projects first. And so a lot of European countries have recognized they are in a race for hydrogen and the jobs that go with it. And hence, it's not just the UK that set targets, but most of the, shall we say, northern European countries have now got targets of gigawatts by the end of this decade.
No, that's excellent. Thanks, Matthew. And it's like very, very relevant as well, because like I guess the important aspect is the fact that, you know, with the opportunity and the potential for scale, it's about finding, you know, sort of the best technical solutions, but also having the ability to be able to ensure that we're advancing at scale the amount of hydrogen that can be generated in order to meet the needs. So that's a brilliant opportunity there to run through so the discussions. We've got questions coming through as well. And one question, if I just flip to that, I want to go to is Dean John has a question. And it's really kind of touched a bit about how about wind to H2 projects for power generation on site-specific basis, i.e. not transported but used. So I guess really we're going back to that decentralized, you know, sort of energy use. And there's parallels there to Dolphin. So I guess, Molly, would you have to go first? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly. And it's a massive opportunity, Dean, and something that as companies look to decarbonize their operations and take a look at their sort of optimal pathway to decarbonisation, it's an opportunity that's been being considered carefully. Quite often there are sort of easier wins in terms of electrification where you can, energy efficiency where you can, and then you get on to, well, for in order to to do fuel switching to hydrogen, or in order to produce hydrogen as a feedstock, where there isn't another option, generating your hydrogen on site, either using grid power or using your own on-site renewables, can be a really compelling solution for that. So we're working with lots of types of clients who are really interested in that. And of course, then you get over the sort of issues around trying to find getting grid access or grid charges. One issue can be the intermittency of supply. So sometimes it can be useful to have backup grid generation to ensure that your hydrogen production is firmed up, and particularly if it's going into an industrial process, that can be an important consideration. But absolutely, I think we're likely to see hydrogen used in a number of contexts, and there's definitely a place for bulk production of hydrogen in, for example, offshore concepts like Dolphin, but there's also a place for localized production of hydrogen close to source, where you then don't have your transportation issues. So certainly that's a really good point, Dean. Thank you for raising that question.
No, that's a brilliant point. And I guess, you know what, we're just about at the half-hour mark, believe it or not. When we were discussing this beforehand, I knew that the opportunity to be able to expand out would escape us. There's so much conversation, there's so much discussion, there's so much great input within the hydrogen economy and the build out of it that half an hour is never enough. But for everybody listening, this is a bit of a taster for what we're looking to bring out in the hydrogen workshop, looking at hydrogen to fuel the energy transition. So what I'm hoping is that for the viewers online, we haven't answered some of your questions. We will have them in the chat. We'll come back to you and we'll look to answer your questions. But if you like what you heard here, you want to hear more from Matthew, you want to hear more from Molly, then please join us on the 16th and 17th of the month, and look online for the SPE Hydrogen Workshop, where we use hydrogen to fuel the energy transition. It's been my absolute pleasure to down here from COP26 to speak to you both. Apologies for the delay when we started, and some technical difficulties, something's getting in the way. But I want to thank you for your patience, and Molly and Matthew, I want to thank you too.
Thanks, John.
And thanks everyone for listening.
That's brilliant. As always,